I believe we are ready to get going today. So, as I was mentioning to a few people at the very beginning, I feel like I have a good indoor projection voice. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, well, then I'll move that out of the way just a little bit. My name is Grady Eades. I am an associate professor of history at Volunteer State Community College. I'm also a former Boxwell staff member. And I am here today to talk about the history of Boxwell Reservation, which is a Boy Scout camp out on Highway 109 in Williamson County. But before I get into all that, I just want to say very quickly, thank you all for being here today. I know that there are lots of things to do, and I appreciate you coming out to see me. And I'd like to thank specifically the Williamson County Library for hosting me today. I'm so glad to be here. I actually am a Franklin native, well, sort of a Franklin native. I at least graduated from Franklin High School and spent most of my teen years growing up in this area. So this is really nice to come back. And for those of you who haven't been around in this area for a really long time, this library is so much nicer than the one that I went to school with. Down around the square, it was terrible. This is a huge step up, so just so that you're aware. So thank you all for being here. And what I want to talk about today is Boxwell. Now, there's part of the conversation today is about the camp itself and some of the physical facilities and how some of that stuff has changed. But what I think is really interesting about Boxwell camp and scouting is how this particular little bubble reflects programming. Okay, the program that it offers and how that reflects changing values in America. So part of what I'm going to be talking about today is how the United States has changed over the last 100 years and how, as the nation has changed, so the scouting program has changed, and so too then has the program at Boxwell changed to try to keep scouting relevant. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm going today. All right. So to get things started, the first theme is about citizenship. So let's start with the idea that scouting in the United States is part of something called the Progressive Era. Okay? Progressivism was a turn of the 20th century movement led primarily by white, middle-class, native-born Americans to reform changes brought on by industrialization. And industrialization, of course, had completely upended everything about American life at the turn of the century. In fact, one of the big changes was urbanization. And urbanization was a major consequence of industrialization and brought on the need for scouting. Well, why is that, you ask? I know you were all thinking that. Men in urban areas were concerned with the future of boys. Cities were growing, and urban growth led to a fear of gangs and hooligans. That's right, hooligans. Men feared that boys would get involved with the wrong crowd, and they wanted a positive outlet for them. Further, urbanization meant that boys weren't getting exposed to the outdoors as much as they used to be, and thus men weren't masculine enough. Scouting then was the answer. It was a program designed to address these issues caused by industrialization. Outdoor skills and life and citizenship training were the solution. So, the Nashville Council, thus, was formed in March of 1920. And by the end of that summer of 1920, famed Vanderbilt track coach William J. Anderson began a 27-year run as the council executive. Now, only part-time, Anderson was the paid professional who oversaw the business of Nashville area scouting. Anderson promised a first-rate council, and any first-rate council needed a first-rate summer camp. Finding a location for such a camp was the responsibility of the council's camping chairman, which was a volunteer, non-paid position. This chairman was a local businessman by the name of Leslie G. Boxwell. Boxwell was an auto enthusiast, serving as a long-term member of the Tennessee Good Roads Association, which was an organization responsible for getting the state's first highway built, the Bristol to Memphis Highway, which is today Highway 70. Boxwell himself ran a metal culvert company and was an ideal choice to build a summer camp. Thus, the search for a summer camp location began. By the spring of 1921, Boxwell had scouted. See what I did there? I'm sorry. Scouted several locations, but all failed to pass muster for various reasons. With the start of summer camp literally days away by the end of June, Boxwell finally settled on a location off of Harding Road in a little community known as Linton. Now, today you can find Linton between Bellevue and Fairview, where Highway 100 crosses the South Harpeth River. The camp was on a little 4 acres of farmland adjacent to the South Carpet that belonged to a man named S.S. Morton. Boxwell and a group of volunteers spent 3 or 4 days preparing the site for scouts to arrive on Monday morning, July 5th, 1921. As a thank you for his efforts, the Council Executive Committee declared the camp would be called Camp L.G. Boxwell. Now, for the modern observer, calling Camp Boxwell at Linton a summer camp is really being very generous. The camp used large World War I surplus tents, each housing 8 scouts apiece. There were only 60 scouts a week that first summer, and camp only ran for 30 weeks. There were no permanent buildings, though the kitchen was semi-permanent in that it had wooden walls, but it had to be screened across the top. There was a flagpole, but no special campfire area or teaching areas. It was really more like an extended camping trip than a summer camp. Even the program the first summer or two was really pretty basic. There was calisthenics before breakfast, flag raisings and lowerings, of course, and what came to be called scout school in the morning before lunch when scouts worked on advancement. And as far as advancement was concerned, they would offer virtually anything that you needed. There was not a defined slate of merit badges that would be offered. The afternoons, however, were not for advancement. They were almost all recreational activities, generally group games like baseball, team building, cooperation and networking, all skills that would be needed by the modern man. After dinner were nightly campfires, each with different themes. Sometimes men from the city would come out to camp to talk to the boys about war, sports, hunting, or business. Other nights were stunt nights, where the boys showed off their particular skills or their talents. By around 10 p.m., the day closed and the scouts went to bed. The program was run by a small paid staff, a camp director, a waterfront director, and a cook. Both the cook and the waterfront may have had an assistant, but everyone else that helped out with the camp was a volunteer adult who came up for that particular week to do whatever needed to be done. Around 1923 is when things began to change. Anderson, known affectionately as Coach by the boys, found himself one day at camp with none of his staff and about 80 boys. While the basic schedule was well established, Anderson realized that a critical component was missing: citizenship. The boys were simply counting on the adults to lead them, when really, if they were going to be good citizens, the kind that scouting was supposed to be making them, they needed to be governing themselves. And so Anderson embarked upon a program of self-government at Boxwell. Now, the new program of self-government had several levels and involved multiple elections. On Monday night, the first night of camp, scouts had an election at the campfire. They elected fellow scouts to 4 camp-wide positions: postmaster, dining hall director, lost and found man, and scribe. Each had a duty they were to perform during the week. Once this election was settled, the scouts went back to their 8-man tents and held their own local election. They chose 2 positions here. One was a tent leader and one was a council representative. The tent leader would oversee morning inspections and keep everyone in the tent on task and make sure they got to where they needed to be on time, while the representative would represent the tent at a camp council meeting that was held after breakfast every morning. Now, the camp council was where the real power was. Here, the scouts set up their own rules for governing the camp. Their own rules for governing the camp. Rules included really obvious things like not speaking after taps, or not touching the ropes on the flagpole, or maybe even how much time scouts could spend in town. And I'm using in town in quotation marks because Linton is really just a wide spot in the road. The scouts policed each other, reporting violations to the camp council, which meant that the camp council thus not only made the rules, it also determined the future of the violators. In short, it had legislative, executive, and judicial functions. Most punishments were actually pretty simple. The most common punishment was to spend the afternoon in the guardhouse, which was the area of the camp where the camp council met. So in the morning they would meet there after breakfast, and then that area would remain vacant during the day unless someone had violated the rule. And then in the afternoon, that particular boy would just sit in that particular location and watch everyone else play and have a good time, which is a terrible punishment for a young boy at this point in time. The most serious violation, though, was to swim on the waterfront without any sort of supervision. Doing so resulted in immediate expulsion from the camp. This approach was buttressed by a series of awards and a final election the last night of camp. At the concluding campfire, scouts were given awards for things like most merit badges completed, but they also voted on who was the best all-around scout and who was the most popular, along with the runner-up. These elections helped provide a carrot to the stick of the guardhouse time. This system was Anderson's solution to the problem of citizenship. In fact, he began to refer to Camp Boxwell as a training school. Here, boys were getting the outdoor experience, the outdoor exposure they needed. They were getting experience in groups, what we would call team building and networking. But most importantly, they were learning the value of choosing their leaders, the power of the rules that they made, and how to enforce those rules. Anderson was training boys to be citizens for when they became men. Therefore, the council would subsidize the cost of camp, keeping it under $5 a week for most of Anderson's term. He wanted to make sure that any scout who wanted to get this training experience could come to camp, and so the council helped subsidize the cost. And Anderson would keep camp open as long as he could every summer. As long as he could get enough boys, he would add another week onto the end of camp. So sometimes camp would open in June and not close until late in August, as long as he could get 80 boys to fill a week. Every boy should have an opportunity to participate. Which is going to bring us into part 2, citizenship with tweaks at the new Boxwell. Now, the training school approach was so successful and so important to Anderson that when the Linton location was abandoned in 1930, remember the first summer was 1921, so we're up to 1930 now, the citizenship school simply moved to the new location. The new location was the Narrows of the Harpeth in Kingston Springs, and the reasons for the move were actually pretty simple. First, the construction of Highway 100 through Linton built a bridge right through the heart of the camp. Remember, it was somebody's farmland, it wasn't a permanent property that the council owned. While the camp could have simply moved a little bit further down the river, there was another problem. After camp ended in August 1929, there was this little thing that happened later that year called the Great Depression. Now, the big picture effects of the Great Depression are pretty well known. 25% unemployment, banks, particularly here in Tennessee, collapsing. There were Hoovervilles, there were Hoover blankets. Scouting in Middle Tennessee was hurt as well. Scouts couldn't buy scout handbooks. Funding for the Nashville Council itself fell by half. Leslie G. Boxwell and Council Treasurer E. Murray had to take out personal loans just to keep camp going during several of these years. 2 councils that were just outside the Nashville area completely collapsed as we moved to the spring of 1930, which means their scouts had no council to serve them and no summer camp to go to. Anderson and the Nashville Council stepped in to assist. So, Camp Boxwell moved in the summer of 1930 to the Narrows of the Harpeth. The Narrows were loaned to the scouts by a local multimillionaire, coal magnate Justin Jet Potter. Though not well known today, Potter was virtually infamous in his own time for his work ethic that brought his fortune, as well as his opposition to unions and later the New Deal. He let the scouts use the site for free throughout the 1930s and eventually sold the property to the Nashville Council in 1944. Boxwell had a new home. And thus, the training school simply moved. There were some tweaks, of course, at the new location. Nightly campfires continued, but the speakers from the city ceased. Punishment for violating the rules of the camp council also continued, but time in the guardhouse was slowly replaced by actual labor, such as toting rocks, peeling potatoes. Youth staff were added by 1932. Volunteer adults still did the primary instruction every week, but 8 Eagle Scouts were chosen for the full summer to assist with the program. And of course, this meant the creative thinking that sometimes goes along with youth, correct? Such as using flour instead of lye in a pit toilet when a national inspection is coming along and you don't have the lye to kill the smell in that nasty pit toilet. Just throw some flour in there. Nobody will know any different. It looks exactly the same. Nobody ever did that, no? Okay. Finally, in 1938, the council introduced the Order of the Arrow at Boxwell, an honor society within scouting to entice older boys to stay in the program as other, shall we say, interests grabbed their attention. The highlight, though, of the Narrows Boxwell was a weekly event known as the Water Carnival. This happened toward the end of the week and involved multiple canoe and swimming races on the waterfront. These might include a backstroke or a dash in swimming. For the canoes, the races would include one-man boat races, races without paddles, or group competitions in war canoes. These turned into big events with the local community coming out to camp to watch and to cheer. Now, all of this said, it's important to note that the program at the Narrows and at Linton before it reflected the values of the nation in one really unsettling way. Camp Boxwell was a segregated camp. Citizenship training apparently was not needed for African American scouts of the Nashville area. Black scouting itself has its own rabbit hole with its own fascinating story. I'm not going to get into that today, but the quick version for our purposes is to understand that beginning in the 1930s, Black troops had their own division that ran separately from, but under the umbrella of, the Nashville Council. It was essentially a council within a council. And until 1943, these scouts did not have their own summer camp. When they got their camp, it was at a different location with a different program and only ran for about 2 weeks. No African American scouts camped at Boxwell throughout these years, but African Americans were not absent. Camp cook Walter Whitaker was there every summer, making the meals from 1921 to 1949. Recruited from the kitchens of Vanderbilt, Whitaker was widely praised for his roles and well known for his reluctance to cook rattlesnake. He sometimes had a cook staff who were also African Americans, and they stayed in a tent by themselves. Whitaker was not hidden, though. He often sang spirituals at Sunday services and often played horseshoes with Anderson. And while a scout favorite, the difference was still clear. While other adults were referred to by their last name, Whitaker was simply called Walter, or even just Walt. Leslie G. Boxwell finally stepped down as council president at the start of 1947. Anderson announced his retirement later that year. For over 25 years, Boxwell and Anderson had worked to provide a quality scout program, both for the council and at summer camp. Anderson's replacement was going to be a professional scouter from West Arkansas, a man by the name of Ward Akers, who took on the job as council executive in September of 1947. Akers continued to hold camp at the Narrows in 1948, but this was not Anderson's Boxwell anymore. The election system did not continue. Camp was only open for a specified period, not as long as the boys would show up. And when camp ended that summer, again 1948, Camp Boxwell did not return to the Narrows. Despite a capital campaign in 1940 that built a new dining hall, a wash house, and installed a new filtration system, Akers argued that the site had, quote, deteriorated beyond repair. Clearly, a new location was desired. And this brings us to part 3, Rock Island. Before we jump into Rock Island, it's important to note that we're now up to 1948, 1949, which means we've gotten through the World War II era. The United States not only survived the Second World War, but emerged as literally the most powerful nation on Earth. The emergence of the Cold War with communist Soviet Union only intensified this newfound confidence and power. The United States not only felt a responsibility to help rebuild Europe, which in turn greatly stimulated the American economy, but there was also a new battle to be fought against atheistic communists. This moral mission to save the world from communism, coupled with the new economic boom, led to a nation quite different from the one in which scouting was born. Families left the cities for the suburbs, reversing a decades-long trend. Pent-up demand from the Depression years led to a consumer explosion and a baby boom. And I can't stress the baby boom enough. At its height in 1957, there is a baby born in the United States every 7 seconds. So if you want to do the math on that real fast in your mind, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, baby. All right, you get it. All right. The new role of the federal government that began under the New Deal led to the GI Bill and to interstates, which in turn led to motels and fast food and Disneyland. The baby boom that emerged by the 40s ushered in a new era of child-related needs, new hospitals, new schools, new summer camps. Not surprisingly, Scouting's membership exploded in these years. In this context, Acres' decision to leave the Narrows makes a whole lot more sense. At just around 100 acres, accommodating 100 Scouts a week, the Narrows Boxwell simply wasn't large enough. The question of where to go, though, proved vexing. A suitable location was just not readily available, so Acres set up camp in a temporary location, the 200-acre summer vacation home of University of Michigan football coach Fielding Yost in Walling, Tennessee. Yost had passed on, and his family was persuaded to sell the property to the National Council, now reorganized as the Middle Tennessee Council. Camp Boxwell moved to the location commonly known as Rock Island for the 1949 season. Now, the program that emerged here was different than the earlier camps. Campfires opened and closed a week. Advancement was now specialized. It was now morning and afternoon and was broken into program areas. Specific skills were taught in specific areas, and there was a specific slate of merit badges that were offered, not a free-for-all any longer, demonstrating the growing importance of advancement. The teaching staff was now primarily paid youth, augmented with a few adults in leadership positions. Scouts now came as a troop, not individually as they had before, and they stayed in group campsites, not simply large tents. The program itself was also a reflection of post-war values, in that the Rock Island Boxwell had a commissary. It was just a little shack, as you can see here, but it sold candy and soft drinks. Consumerism had arrived at camp. The whole week also shifted, running Sunday afternoon to Saturday morning, meaning Scouts were expected to spend Sunday morning church time with their families, not at camp. The family dimension was further reinforced with the introduction of a family campsite. Fathers could bring their wives and younger children up for the week and stay together in a designated campsite with other families. Even the meals buttressed the idea of family. No longer did a scout need to bring a mess kit to summer camp. Plates, platters, utensils, cups were all provided. Scouts sat down at a dinner table with all the food and platters that were then passed around, just like a family meal. Family-style feeding taught manners and gave each scout a chance to be the head of the table. Now, that said, Rock Island was still a segregated camp. No African American scouts camped here, and for most years, the only African American on property was the camp cook, a man named Ike Davis. It would take the civil rights movement before this situation would change. Still, remember that Boxwell at Rock Island was supposed to be temporary. The plan was one summer, and then something more permanent would be found. As the baby boom really hit its stride in the 1950s and attendance continued to grow, finding a new location became critical. By 1952, a new location was identified, and by 1954, some initial property was purchased. But the camp could not move yet. This was because the new property was on the yet-to-be-created Old Hickory Lake Reservoir. Securing the land would require a special federal legislation because the property was owned by the United States Army. With a special act of Congress in hand, by the fall of 1957, a capital campaign was launched in January 1959 to build not one, but 4 camps on the 750-acre site. The new Boxwell Reservation on Old Hickory Lake would open in 1960. And this brings us to part 4, the Old Hickory Lake Boxwell, the camp that Acres built. Chaired by Acres' close friend E.B. Stallman of the Nashville Banner, the 1959 Capital Development Campaign had a goal of $891,000. Kicked off in January, and by its close in June had raised over $1 million, making it the largest capital campaign in the history of scouting. I'll make sure I stress that again. Not the history of Middle Tennessee or the state of Tennessee, in the history of scouting. Construction began immediately. The campaign, and even the reservation itself, was really important for two reasons. First, it really reflected the optimism of the late 1950s and early 1960s. Remember, 1960 was the year that the youthful John F. Kennedy was elected as president. By May 1961, Kennedy had charged the nation to land a man on the moon in a decade. This is a nation that believed it could do anything. And it is in this period before Vietnam and anti-war protests that this sense of anything was possible was everywhere. Boxwell Reservation was the embodiment of this big dreams do come true ideal. The other thing to keep in mind is that the capital campaign also represented an important shift in thinking about programming. The campaign promised amazing facilities and a much easier camping experience. Tents would be placed on platforms up off the ground. Dining halls would be large buildings with concrete floors, fireplaces, and roofs. There would be multiple shower houses with hot water and flush toilets. This was luxury camping. But it was a critical new way to think about camping. Now, the facilities mattered. To provide a solid experience for scouts, the facilities had to be top-notch and their design had to be interesting. Also, keep in mind the size of this new site, 750 acres with four camps. In order to serve multiple camps at one time, something none of the other Boxwells had done, top-notch facilities were needed just to make it all happen. Thus, when Boxwell Reservation opened, there was not a great deal of talk about what the daily program for scouts looked like. All the conversation was about the facilities. First, there was a boat harbor known as the ski dock to take advantage of the enormous Old Hickory Lake. There were 4 camps at the new Boxwell. 2 were Boy Scout resident camps, Camp Stallman and Camp Parnell, each designated to serve 250 to 300 scouts a week, each of which was more than what Rock Island was doing at the time. The 3rd camp was a family camp, Camp Murray. This was the family campsite idea taken up to the next level. Families still stayed in tents, but had superior toilet facilities and their own dining hall and their own activities. They even had their own waterfront with swimming and skiing opportunities for the kids. The 4th camp was originally planned to be another resident camp, but as often happens with capital campaigns, costs ran over, and so the 4th camp became a wilderness camp, Camp White. All 4 camps were named for significant contributors to the campaign or to the council itself. Now, from a more traditional program perspective, New Boxwell was very similar to the Rock Island Boxwell. Opening and closing campfires, advancement in specific areas in the morning and in the afternoon, family-style feeding, and bigger commissaries, now selling branded t-shirts and branded merchandise. But there were 2 really significant shifts at the new Boxwell in regard to program. First, a new staff position emerged, something called a program director. This person's sole responsibility was to oversee and develop program, the activities of the camp. And second, and perhaps more interestingly, and definitely very organically, dining hall program emerged. Now, nothing like this had existed at the other Boxwells. The larger space for meals led to staff presenting songs and games at the meals, adding an informational entertainment dimension to camp and making it something quite different from meals at school. It is worth finally noting that at Boxwell Reservation, integration finally occurred in 1965. Passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in July of the previous year brought legal pressure on the council to end its separate but equal approach. Thus, 1965 was the first integrated summer, although integrated is a little generous. African American scouts went to Parnell at the end of the summer in their own week. Still, an African American joined the program staff at Parnell in 1967, and by 1968, the entire reservation was fully integrated. No more separate weeks, no more separate program. As far as the reservation itself was concerned, initial construction from that 59 campaign ended officially in 1961. The Cripple Crab, that odd leaning building that you see as you drive into the reservation, was one of the last things built from the 59 campaign. But projects continued throughout the 1960s. 1968 became the peak year of camp attendance, with approximately 4,300 scouts. That doesn't include the leaders, that doesn't include the families, that's just Boy Scouts, attending camp that summer. In hindsight, this could easily be attributed to the peak of the baby boom, but at the time, it was attributed to the success of the camp and the scouting program. So another capital campaign was developed and launched in 1972. The 72 campaign had a goal of $4.7 million and would complete Acres' dream of yet another resident camp at Boxwell, Camp Craig, and would also build a proper Scout Service Center in Nashville, today the Jet Potter Center, and a canoe base on the Buffalo River, Grimes Canoe Base. While the campaign fell just short of its goal, coming in at $4.6 million, it was again the largest capital campaign in the history of Scouting. And then, almost out of nowhere, came the end of the Ward Acres era. The Vietnam War and Watergate had led to a crisis in confidence and leadership at all levels of American society. Not even nonprofits were safe from investigations. In July 1975, the Nashville Banner, no longer led by the Stallman family, the council-friendly Stallman family, charged Ward Acres of nepotism, misuse of funds and property, and frankly, being overpaid. After some initial fumbles and handling such negative publicity, the council launched a thorough investigation of all charges. Acres was cleared, but to avoid the stench of any impropriety, the aging executive decided to retire. The man who had transformed scouting in Middle Tennessee left the stage. Which leads us to part 5, A Scout is Thrifty. It was perhaps appropriate that Acres retired when he did. The euphoria of what was possible and what America could do that had so characterized the 1950s and 60s, and even Acres himself, was really gone by the mid-1970s. The baby boom was over, as was the post-World War II economic boom. They were replaced by growing inflation and unemployment. Distrust, dissatisfaction abounded. As the 1970s progressed into the 1980s, a growing conservative movement returned to politics, stressing less government, fewer regulations, more morality. Middle Tennessee Scouting was right in the middle of all of this. Membership numbers plummeted in the 1970s and did not rise steadily again until the mid-1980s. At Boxwell, no council executive would ever be as involved in camp program and development the way that Anderson and Acres were. The supervision of the reservation and summer camp program fell under the direction of the reservation director, the professional scouter who actually ran the facility. Now, this wasn't a new position, but what was new was that this person's vision now guided the camp more than the council executive. Beginning in the summer of 1976, that new man was Tom Wilhite. And he was the perfect man for the job in this climate. From the Sparta area, Wilhite was the living embodiment of the 11th point of the Scout Law, a scout is thrifty. He could stretch a dollar further than anyone else. And while he had hard choices to make, he guided the camp through these very frugal years. There was significant belt tightening. Camp was shortened to just 5 weeks of scouts from 8 as membership declined. Camps Craig and Parnell began a rotation. So despite there being 3 scout camps on property, only 2 were ever in operation. The boat harbor was closed, as boats were expensive to maintain. Electricity was pulled from all non-essential sites. Family-style feeding was replaced with cafeteria-style and trays, as it was deemed more efficient. Rope was even replaced with twine. It was a lot. But Wilhite also looked for ways to improve the program to keep scouts coming back to camp, and maybe even recruit new boys. Rappelling was added to the program as a camp afternoon activity in the late 1970s. By 1985, this had blossomed into a full-blown camp program known as COPE, which focused on team and confidence building. COPE attracted older boys, While COPE attracted older boys, for younger boys, a greater emphasis was placed on Cub Scouts, those scouts under 11. Cub and partner events occurred during select weekends of the summer to give Cubs a positive first camping experience. Will had also cultivated stable leadership at camp. Ernie Ragsdale at Staunton, Jerry Barnett at Parnell Craig, and his own daughter Kristen at Murray. The leadership and their staffs reflected the conservative mindedness of the period. A patriotism infused the program, but there was also a strong distrust of the establishment. While there was great respect for Will Hite, staff often displayed an incredible distrust of professional scouters and their lack of experience in the trenches that would have surprised previous generations of staff. Still, these staff were infused with a loyalty to Barnett and to Ragsdale, who stood as father figures in a time when divorce rates dominated the headlines. By the mid-1980s, the financial situation and membership had improved. Indeed, the momentum was so strong that another new capital campaign was launched in 1994. The $7.8 million campaign was the first pass at modernizing the 30-plus-year-old camp. New handicap-accessible shelters, sites, and trails were built, and the boat harbor was reopened. The major focus, though, was on Camp Murray, which had not survived the transition from the 1970s very well. As both parents went to work to grapple with inflation and the decline of real wages, fewer families spent their vacations at Murray. Murray was repurposed by the 1994 campaign into a camp just for Cub Scouts, Gaylord Cub World. Expanding the Murray Dining Hall, building play facilities like a pirate ship and a castle, Cub World was designed exclusively for younger Scouts. The whole camp built upon Will Hite's Cub and Partner Weekends philosophy. Give a good experience when they are young, and those Cubs will stay to become Boy Scouts. Will Hite himself finally retired in 1994. He was replaced by professional scouter Larry Green. Green was ideally suited for the role with long experience connected to Boxall all the way back to his own youth. Indeed, Green represented how far camp had come since integration in 1965. Unfortunately, Green did not get along well with the new council executive who had arrived in 1995, and as a result, Green retired after only 2 summers, and a new reservation director, Ron Turpin, arrived in 1997. Which brings us to the modern era. Now, not surprisingly, the United States was a very different world in 1997 than the one that we started with. The end of the Cold War and the start of the technology revolution stimulated the economy, just as industrialization had transformed the nation 100 years earlier. The technology revolution changed the way Americans lived their lives. Indeed, by 2008, the first iPhone, a handheld touchscreen phone / internet-connected computer, was introduced. The technology revolution was coupled with the growing fruits of the civil rights movement a generation earlier. By the end of the 20th century, the United States was far more inclusive in terms of gender, race, and even sexual orientation. These technological and social changes raised serious questions for scouting and for summer camp. How does scouting stay relevant in an increasingly tech-centered world? Did the outdoors still matter as much to being masculine? Could youth be adequately protected in a digital world? Were scouting's values really just for heterosexual males, or were they transcendent values, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, or race? Unlike most of his predecessors, Ron Turpin had extensive experience outside of Middle Tennessee Council and was able to bring that experience to camp operations and programming. For instance, background checks were instituted for all adult staff to provide youth protection against predators. Registration processes for camp and for advancement were done before camp on computers using spreadsheets. Women were hired as part of the program staff. First, older married women, but then youth females as well. A 15-year-old female could work on camp staff by the early 2000s just as easily as a 15-year-old male. Homosexuals were hired too, though this was admittedly more of a don't ask, don't tell approach for many years. And anticipating big growth in this period, meals were broken into shifts to accommodate more people. New approaches and solutions came to Boxwell as well. New shower houses were built along with a swimming pool, which was especially useful for cubs who were terrified of the lake. And high adventure equipment was purchased and a return to the facilities as program approach. A greater emphasis on utilizing the property all year round grew, and winter camp, a week-long camping experience in December, was introduced in 2004. Perhaps the most profound change came in 2016 when Camp Parnell's dining hall was transformed into a STEM center with a slate of technology-related advancement and skills taught. Now, those scouts interested in engineering, electronics, robotics, nuclear physics could get that experience at summer camp. The technology revolution was finally embraced at Boxwell. The modern camp program was also characterized by increasing variety. Struggling to compete with a world where kids had endless choices for their summertime, Turpin's successor, Carl Adkins, focused more on entertainment and newness to keep scouts coming back to camp every summer. Every summer, a new program idea was introduced. The idea might exist for one summer or for several, but there was constantly something new to promote. Thus, as the reservation celebrated its centennial in 2021, a new capital campaign was underway with the goal of building a new dining hall at Stallman, even newer shower houses to better accommodate the growing number of females in scouting, and a skilled trades center to introduce some more hands-on work for scouts. Current reservation director, Jason Flannery, continues to work to keep Boxwell appealing to modern scouts. And so, for 100 years, the scouting experience at Boxwell has continuously reinvented itself to reflect the changing needs of the nation's youth it is serving. Thank you for your time today. So two things here real quickly. First of all, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. If you were interested in a book, okay, which goes into more detail and is way more interesting than listening to me talk. I have books here that I'm happy to sell and will sign for you. You can also buy a couple for your friends at your favorite online retailers, okay, Amazon and the like. But I'm also happy to take any questions that you may have about Boxwell and how it worked, or how, I don't know everything, but clearly I know a few things, and I'll see what I can do for you.
I think we mentioned Larry Green as the camp director.
Yes.
He stayed in scouting.
Larry has an incredibly long experience. So he joined the professional, he started as the ranger staff in the 1960s, joined the professional staff in the 1970s, and worked his way all the way up to become what they call Director of Support Services, which was the reservation director in 95 and 96. When he stepped down as reservation director, he went back to a district after that.
District executive.
Yes, which was obviously a pretty big step down in a lot of ways, but he was a lot happier because he was out of the direct line of fire of the council executive. Yes. And he stayed in that position for several more years before he retired, and then he kind of washed his hands of everything for a little while. The politics changed somewhat down in Nashville, and he was asked to come back as a volunteer at Cub World. And he has been camp commissioner at Cub World for the last 5 or 6 years easily. So yeah, he can't stay away.
You can't keep it down.
No, absolutely. So he has probably a longer living history with it now than I think probably anybody else. So yeah, there's a great job. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Tell me what you know about Ranger Willie Paul.
How convenient that you asked that. Ranger Willie, his actually real name is, of course, Dean Willie Claude. He ended up being called Willie by the council executive that hired him. He actually started in the 1972 campaign, if I'm not incorrect. He was the first ranger at Grimes Canoe Base and was out there for several years, running Grimes until the first ranger under Tom Wilhite retired. I'm trying to remember who that was right off the top of my head. It was not, it's irrelevant. Willie Claude was brought to camp in the late 70s or early 80s. He stayed up until 1995. So he had a good long run out there. Your father, I believe? Yes. And that's actually, Willie was the one that I grew up under. He was the ranger that was there when I was there. So I remember Willie very fond of him.
And you left us out of the book.
Willie is in there. It's in there. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Do you have anything in the book about what's happening at Latimer?
I have that Latimer exists, and and when it showed up, but Latimer was not the focus. It was primarily on Boxwell itself. There was, and I mentioned that because at the time that Latimer was being developed, there was some fear that the Boxwell program would move to Latimer, which can't happen for two reasons. One, because Latimer is a high adventure program. It's a very different setup than what Boxwell is. But the other thing is, and I explained this in a little more detail in the book, this just wasn't the venue for it, but that special act of Congress from 1957 specifies that it had two stipulations to it that when the federal government gave the land to the Scouts. The first one was they had to start building on it within 3 years. So that's why the capital campaign starts in '59, because they had to get on it quickly. But the second one was that the council was allowed to keep that property as long as it stayed a scout camp. If it stopped being a scout camp, it reverted back to the Corps of Engineers. So if there's ever talk, and I know there has been at various times, that whole stretch out there on 109 has become so valuable over the years as it has continued to develop, that maybe the council would sell off some of that land out on the outskirts, and then we'd start using the property for something else. I don't think they can do that per the terms of that legislation from 1957.
There's a lot more noise pollution on the lake now during summer camp than there was back in the 60s and 70s.
As I'm sure you're well aware, some of the folks that I talked to who ran the boat harbor back in the day, there's very little traffic in the 60s and early 70s, and the boat harbor basically ran the lake for those 8 weeks of the summer. Very different place now.
Is it still 750 acres?
Oh no, sir, it's over 1,000 now. It's almost 1,300 acres. They have continued to buy land as the years have gone by.
Where did the term cripple crab come from? I'm very dear to that. I visited as a youth from Memphis in the early 70s, then moved here, brought my son to camp for several years, Cub World and Boy Scout camp, and now my grandson, we've taken him out to Boxwell. So where did cripple crab come from?
All right, so cripple crab is its nickname. Okay, in fact, technically, the term when it originates is crippled crab, and the D part has just been dropped. Because the building was of such an unusual design, they had to bring a model out so the builders could actually see how this would all work. I'm hesitant to tell the story in mixed company. It was because basically what happened is that if I recall correctly, it was Wilbur Creighton was one of the men who was looking with E.D. Stallman, was looking at the design of the building as it was being built, and he exclaimed when he saw it that it looked like one of the medics said that it looked like a sexually excited turtle, and the other one said no, it's a crippled crab, and that's where the nickname stuck. So Faulkner Hickerson, yes, Faulkner Hickerson, yes, the architect. Detailed the story. There's a nice letter that he gave to doing the 1983 Boys Will Be Men book that explains that. But yeah, it's a nickname that came from those guys when they were looking at the model. Yeah.
What year were you on the staff, or years?
Sure. So I started in 1990, 15 years old, at Camp Craig, and then I was out there for 8 summers. 1997 was my last one. And I was program director at Parnell, which as it turns out was one of the last summers that Parnell was open as a resident camp. 1998 was its last summer before it went into rotation and then just never opened again as a Boy Scout camp. And so when the dining hall became a STEM center, that has really started sort of a renaissance there of reusing that camp for something again. Yes, 90 to 1997. Yes.
How long did it take you to complete this project?
Too long. So I had been picking at it for some years. So, gosh, I guess. So after I finished my time at camp in '97, I started grad school in 1998. and myself and several others who are much older than I am, I'd kind of been taken in under their wing. They were very interested in the history of the camp, and so they started conducting interviews with people and collecting some stories. And I was part of that process. That's where Virtual Boxwell was born. If you've ever been to that website, that's all that grows out of that work in the late 90s and early 2000s. And somewhere in that process, as I became a professional historian, I decided that I really wanted to do the book or do a book, and I just kind of picked at it for a while. And then I think it was about 2013, to be honest. I was at the Nashville Public Library. I was going through some microfilm on Linton, trying to learn, because basically nobody knows anything about Linton anymore. We didn't know how it worked. We didn't know when exactly where it served. We didn't know where it was. And it was in the course of looking up Linton that I ran across the date of July 5th, 1921, and realized that that was when camp opened, the very first camp opened, and then realized, oh, that's not very far away. If I'm going to do this thing, I need to have it done by the centennial. And so things picked up exponentially from there, trying to get it done. So the better part of 20 years, really hard for about the last 7. So.
How much did you find in the way of the archives of the Scout Office about this? Very much at all or not? So what was your load of information coming from? Interviews?
So most of you have 2 questions, let me answer that. So first of all, the Scout Office keeps very little of this sort of stuff. There is some, I'm not gonna say there's not any, I was actually there just Thursday, and it was down the, I don't wanna call it an archives, it's really just a basement down where the HVAC is. And some old file cabinets that are still there. And so there's pieces of some stuff that's still there. I ran across a lot of things on the Jet Potter plans. They still have blueprints of the Jet Potter Center from the 72 campaign. But as far as anything predating this Boxwell, almost nothing. I mean, there's very little there. So most all of my information came from interviews, it came from newspaper research, and it came from people knowing that I did this, and things would just sort of show up. So for instance, as we were flipping through here, there was that map of Narrows of the Harpeth and a map of Rock Island, and those are things that just sort of appeared. And that sounds very ominous and kind of suspicious and sketchy, but that's kind of what happened. People would come to me and say, hey, I found this. What is this? Oh, well, that's this. Can I have this? And people would hand it over, I'd get a copy. So very, very, very piecemeal. Now, the flip side of that is, I don't know if anybody actually cares about this, but my plan in the grand scheme of things was, once this was done, I wanted to take everything, and either digitize everything that I could, or just keep a hold of all the hard copies. And my plan is to give it all over to the state archives at some point in the future, so that if someone wants to do something like this again, they don't have to start from scratch. All of the information is somewhere where it's not going to be thrown away, and it will be kept and preserved for other generations to use.
Do you think that the professional scouts that run the Middle Tennessee Council now have looked at the work that you've done and thought about how they need to rethink how they keep track of the history as it goes forward by having camp photographers that are professional photographers each year at camp and keeping records about what transpires, or do you think they're just saying, well, this is great, but thank you very much?
I will take the appropriately political answer and say I cannot speak for the Middle Tennessee Council. I do not know what everything is.
Because I know when I worked there, there was only one summer we had a professional official photographer for camp. And that's why there's so few staff photos back in those years, which is, I think that's at least changed a bit now.
It has, and to that I will say 2 things. One is that summer that you're talking about, 1970, when Chris Eckert was the kid, was the photographer. Those photographs are phenomenal.
Yeah. That's the photo you get on the site.
The one that's on the site today is from him.
Yeah.
So yes, those photographs are phenomenal. Some of the best ones that I have. They're crisp, they're clear. He did a great job. Love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wish there were more of those. Those were some of the best ones that I have. I do know that Jason Flannery, the current reservation director, has started doing some of that. Most of the pictures that he has had a camp photographer for at least the last 2019 and then 2021, because they didn't have camp in 2020 because of COVID. So that has started now. He's using most of that for promotional tools.
Right.
Facebook Live sorts of things. But once they're taken, they exist. And as long as there's people out there that are willing to collect those and hold on to them, then yeah, there is a record. Now, how long that will continue, I don't know. He's not doing it with a history idea in mind. It is really more campaign promotion
Right.
for social media type of things.
Okay.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for coming out today. It was great to see everybody. If you have anything else, I'll be hanging out up here. Thank you so much.